Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Yacono. On this week's episode, we have a timely discussion of the newly published Spring 2021 Regulatory Agenda, in which our regular This Week team analyzes and unpacks new regulations the various immigration agencies hope to promulgate. Finally, we turn to a discussion of the budget reconciliation process with special guest and BPC Action Managing Director Laura Hall. More of that to come, so stick around. 2 times a year, the federal government publishes a regulatory agenda, which is a preview of all of the proposals that are in the pipeline to become federal regulations. Last week, the Biden administration released its 2021 Spring Regulatory Agenda, which subsequently indicated the many ways the White House intends to move away from the Trump era, in everything from legal immigration to asylum and the border. Although not every proposed rule on the agenda will end up being finalized, the agenda signals an administration's priorities and its goals for pursuing changes to the immigration system through executive action. With us today to unpack the many rules the various agencies have proposed is This Week regular Teresa Cardinal-Brown and immigration fellow Sadiq Shinapal. Welcome back to you both.
Hey, Rachel.
So Teresa, I'll start with you. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the new rules the agencies hope to promulgate, I think it'll be helpful for both, our listeners and myself. We would benefit from a brief explanation of the federal rulemaking process. So can you give us a little overview of how the rulemaking process works and how these rules and regulations differ from executive orders and what the odds are that every single one of these rules actually be finalized?
Everything an agency does with regard to rulemaking, and even some things that aren't technically considered regulation, come under the purview of a law called the Administrative Procedure Act. The Administrative Procedure Act is the law that governs exactly how the executive branch can propose, make, and change the policies of how it executes the law, right? So if we go back to our constitutional civics lesson, Congress makes the laws, the executive branch executes the laws. In other words, they carry them out. But the agencies and the executive branch has a lot of discretion oftentimes in how they carry out those laws. Sometimes the laws that Congress passes are really high level. It just says the agencies shall make sure that X happens. Exactly how that happens is up to the agency. So for example, Congress says that the government shall allow a process for immigrants to apply to come to the United States to do certain things. The agencies then get to set out through policies and regulations the mechanism by which immigrants actually make those applications. So USCIS has a slew of regulations about the ways and methods and standards and proof that people have to file to get an immigration status or a visa. Customs and Border Protection has regulations about how people cross the border and the rules that people have to follow to cross the border. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has regulations about the enforcement process. So for an agency to promulgate regulations outlining these efforts, they do so via a process called rulemaking. That means they first have to propose a rule in writing. That written proposal is published in the government document called the Federal Register, which is published every day. The proposal is usually put forward for public comment. So the public has a chance to comment on that regulation, whether they like it, whether they don't like it, whether there's issues with it or how it will function. The agencies then take all those comments into account, decide whether or not to change their proposal, and then issue a final regulation. Once a regulation is issued in final form, it becomes the standard. And regulations, once issued in final form, remain in place throughout subsequent administrations unless or until a new rule is published over it. And that new rule has to go through the same process. So that's the generalized process of rulemaking. Now, it can be shortcut sometimes in different ways. If there is an emergency need to put a regulation forward, they can skip the initial notice and comment part and go out with something called an interim final rule, which means a rule that's put in place and effective immediately, but still they have to take comments and they can finalize it later. They have to show good cause. some kind of emergency that requires this to happen right away and go into effect. So there are standards and rules. One of the things we learned, and regular listeners of this podcast who have heard the gavel will understand, is that if the government fails to follow those requirements from the Administrative Procedures Act, people can sue them in federal court and say this regulation can't be valid because they didn't follow the rules. And we saw that under the Trump administration, and a lot of the rules that they tried to do were stopped by the courts because they said you didn't follow it the right way. This administration is already being sued about some of its actions. So it's a really powerful tool, the Administrative Procedure Act, that governs how the government can regulate and how people can address how the government regulates it. Regulations are somewhat different from executive orders that the president does. The regulatory authority is in the hands of cabinet level officials, Senate confirmed department heads, and the officials that they delegate to. It's not the president's authority per se to regulate. So every rule that's promulgated is promulgated by a cabinet department or an agency. We found out the importance of that Senate confirmed head because several of the rules the Trump administration put in place were rendered invalid in the courts because they said the acting secretary wasn't legally in that position and so didn't have the authority to issue the rule. An executive order, though, is an order that's issued by the president, and it's essentially a directive to the cabinet agencies to say, I want you to make rules on these subjects that do these things. So it's more of an executive direction to the cabinet level agencies that then can result in rulemaking. So that's the overall process. There are thousands and thousands of regulations that are issued every year by agencies. The Federal Register is published every single weekday. It's all on the web, and you can go look at federalregister.gov and you can see all the rules that are being promulgated today and tomorrow. And as you mentioned, every so often, the government puts out a list of everything they want to do in the future so you can get a free peek.
That's the perfect segue to, the next portion of the segment. So one of the first things I noticed when going over the list of new changes was the proposed rule to preserve and fortify the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And Teresa, as we've discussed a myriad of times here on the podcast, the legality of DACA has constantly been left to the fate of the courts. So can you talk a little bit about what this proposed rule seeks to do?
I think the main thing to understand is that the DACA program, even though it's been around now for almost a decade, was created via a memorandum. It was not created via the notice and comment rulemaking. It was not put into regulation. Certain programs that an executive branch agency can do can be done without promulgating regulations. But as we've seen with DACA, it can be subject to court challenge. So by promulgating a rule for DACA, the administration is hoping to solidify and strengthen the program. As I said, a regulation once finalized, unless it's struck down by the court, continues the obligation on the next administration to continue that program unless they go through the whole rulemaking process again. So by creating the DACA program in regulation rather than just by memorandum, it would give the program more legal standing and shore it up against future administrations taking it apart quickly like the Trump administration tried to do. So we don't know exactly what's going to be in the DACA regulation, but the indication the administration wants to do it, I think, is a strong indication that, if Congress doesn't act, for example, to legalize the Dreamers, that it would continue the DACA program in some form and fashion.
So another proposed rule that the White House hopes to change is inadmissibility pursuant to public charge grounds. And in 2019, for our listeners to have a brief background, USCIS announced this rule, which would restrict poor immigrants, so those liable to become a public charge, from obtaining green cards. And the rule was mired in controversy and was also passed back and forth in the courts until November 2020, when the Northern District Court in Illinois determined that the rule violated the Administrative Procedures Act, as Teresa mentioned. And the decision was appealed to the Seventh Circuit, which issued a ruling affirming the lower court decision in March of this year, rendering the public charge rule officially vacated. So, Teresa, what is the Biden administration proposing to do in its new public charge rule?
Understanding the history of public charge is important because When the public charge ground of inadmissibility was first attempted to be regulated was under the Clinton administration. They published a proposed rule that was never made final. So for most of modern history and immigration, the public charge provisions of the law have been implemented by basically a series of policy guidance. There wasn't strict regulation around what was or was not considered a public charge. Like the DACA rule, I think that the idea that the administration wants to promulgate a new public charge rule that will probably look very different from the rule the Trump administration want to put forward is their attempt to solidify sort of maybe existing policy memoranda about what constitutes public charge in regulation so that, again, a future administration couldn't very quickly or easily change those criteria without going through the new rulemaking process again. And I think it's important to understand that we don't know exactly what they will put in the public charge rule. What's happening right now is that since the Trump rule was vacated, the USCIS has reverted back to the criteria for public charge that existed in memoranda basically from the 1990s. A lot of new forms were created and new obligations, affidavits of support and things like that are no longer required. And even people who had applications turned down based on the new public charge rules have the ability to go back to USCIS and ask for those cases to be reconsidered under the previous standard. So again, I think it is mostly about this administration trying to, if you will, put policies in place that are future-proofed against further significant rollbacks from future administrations.
Sadiksha, I want to turn to you now to talk about some of the other proposed rule changes at USCIS and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So first and foremost, what caught my attention was proposed changes to what has been the controversial ICE student visa rule. So can you give us a refresher on what that rule was and how the new 2021 agenda seeks to change it?
Yeah, sure. So the ICE rule, which is actually a very, very long title for it, and I will read it out for you guys. Establishing a fixed time period of admission and an extension of stay procedure for non-immigrant academic students, exchange visitors, and representatives of foreign information media. Now, to break that down, what that means is under the Trump administration, and this came at the heels of another ICE announcement that was passed earlier in the summer that said that any student that were enrolled in just virtual classes would have to leave the country after a certain amount of time. When there was an immense amount of backlash from that rule, the Trump administration rescinded, the ICE actually rescinded that rule. And then a couple of months later, implemented this rule change, which would prevent academic students from some countries gaining student visas for more than 2 years. So what this means is if you are in a bachelor's degree and you're a foreign student who's here for mostly a 4-year program, you would have to renew your visa every 2 years. This could be immensely disruptive to foreign students. It also would mean that for some countries that the Trump administration and precisely President Trump considered, quote unquote, not good countries, they would not be able to get a visa for more than 2 years, regardless of the length of the program. These countries were mostly African countries, Iran, Nepal, where I'm from. They wouldn't be able to stay here for more than 2 years, regardless of the length of the program. So it limits foreign students who are in the United States. It makes it harder. And this comes at the heels of almost when, according to open enrollment data, foreign student enrollment in the United States is already at a historic low. And it's also low because of, the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of students are not coming to the US anyway. So it makes sense for the administration to withdraw this program. I mean, foreign students, any rule against foreign students in the United States, last summer, we saw with the backlash that it's not popular. And if you want to project this welcoming attitude, which the Biden administration ran under, open immigration, legal immigration, it kind of fits that rhetoric of that we are welcoming, you are accepted here. So withdrawing this seems like it's a good position for the administration.
So in addition to that rule, USCIS is also changing its fee schedule once again. And I feel like USCIS is constantly changing its fee schedule left and right. And previously, DHS adjusted the fees in 2007, 2010, 2016, and most recently in August of 2020. So Sadiksha, can you talk a little bit about the proposed changes to the fee schedule and why this is significant within the larger context of how USCIS is funded?
This is very complicated, and so I'll try to break it down in simpler terms for people. It was almost really hard for me to kind of understand where these fee schedule changes were coming from, and I've written about this. So just to give a little context and background, USCIS had this massive budget shortfall August of last year in 2020, right? They averted almost like 70% of their employees were about to get furloughed, and they averted that. Congress then passed this emergency stopgap utilization act that allowed the USCIS to tap into their premium processing funds. They could also expand those premium processing, which means that you get your forms processed faster. So they are also expanding those services to other forms. And then in October 2020, they decided that they wanted to, they couldn't sustain themselves. Like they were saying that we don't have enough funds to sustain through the year. It's unclear if it's like COVID that's doing that, or if we don't know where they're spending their funds. So it's hard to understand why they're having this big budget shortfall. But in October 2020, they were like, we're going to increase the fees. Like you mentioned, it was increased in 2016. So in 2020, they're like, we're going to increase it by a weighted 20%. A weighted 20%. What does that mean? Like for some forms, like the H-1B, the visa increase would be like 21%. But for other visas, such as the L visa, the weighted increase would lead to a 75% increase in like form charges. What does this mean? This means that most people who are applying here for naturalization, coming here in legal terms for H-1Bs, have to pay higher fees to come into the United States. Why does the USCIS continually come across this problem? Well, because 97% of USCIS budget is based on user fees. We had this Appropriation Act passed in 1989 that said that, a government agency can set fees for the services rendered. This was during the INS phase in the 1990s, and then USCIS inherited these user fees. And unlike other countries, like in Canada, where form processing and form services are almost appropriated by the Canadian government, USCIS does not receive any funds. Just because we are going to be talking about the budget later, I just want to quickly plug that this is probably the first year that the president's budget has allocated some funds for asylum processing to USCIS, which means that they understand that these shortfalls are happening and that USCIS is going to require government funding. So what does this mean for the fee schedule changes? We don't know how much percentage they're going to change. They haven't established that yet. But if the fee changes does happen to what the October 2020 fee changes were, it is going to be a significant difference for legal immigration. It's going to be harder to apply for those forms. Just a quick information there too, that in October when those fees were passed, they were enjoined by courts, which said that they were not allowed to haphazardly increase fees by such a significant amount. So now with this new administration, they're taking steps through the regulatory changes to increase those fees again. And we have to wait and see what the fee changes are going to look like.
Thanks, Sadiksha. That is an extremely complicated process, but appreciate your detailed explanation. So I just want to finally turn to a Department of Labor proposed rule, and they are proposing amending certain regulations to establish a new wage methodology for setting prevailing wage levels for the H-1B, the H-1B1, E3, and PERM programs. And for our listeners that are not familiar with prevailing wage levels, can you talk a little bit about the significance of this rule and its implications for employers that hire non-citizens pursuant to these categories?
This is also one of those rules that is like relic from the Trump administration. And as Teresa mentioned about the regulatory changes and how it works, this rule actually encapsulates all of it. There was the interim final rule change that was blocked by a court because it violated APA. Then there was the final rule change. It was a parting gift from the Trump administration. It has been very controversial on either end of the spectrum for people who support it and people who don't support it. So I'm going to try to break it down a little bit. It was first published in October, and the rule change would mean that for prevailing wages for entry-level jobs and all the way through high-skilled jobs mostly in H-1Bs and skill level, the wage determination currently stands in 4 levels, like, prevailing wage level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And for entry-level jobs, it would be like 17% of the wage determination would be around 17% of the wages. That would be going up to 45%, like the average wage offered to foreign citizens. It would go from on wage level 2 from 34% to 63%. On wage level 3, it would go from 50% of wage determination to 78%. So what does this mean? It means that, for example, and I'm just throwing out numbers here, and we've covered this in one of our previous podcasts. So if listeners are interested to go back to see how this breakdown works, it means that, if your entry-level position requires like $40,000 for hiring a foreign worker, now it would mean you would have to pay the same foreign worker for an entry-level position like $75,000. So it would be much more expensive for employers to hire foreign workers. When it was published in October, there was a lot of controversy around it. Then in December, it was blocked by the court because precisely it did not pass the Administrative Procedure Act. Then it was withdrawn. Then in January 14th, as a parting gift, the Trump administration introduced this rule again as a final rule, but it had a delayed effect. So even currently, the rule would not take into effect until November 14th of 2022. So now the Biden administration is proposing these kind of wage determination rules again, knowing Biden's labor history and him being a union guy. It could be that there's this certain level of protection for American workers, and there is support for these kind of rule change determination on one side, being it would protect American workers from their jobs being taken by cheap labor. But then there is also argument on the other side of the spectrum, being if foreign workers are already being paid prevailing wages for the area that they live in, and employers are going to have a harder time finding employment, especially for job requirements that needs just a college degree. That's also true for people who come here on student visa, and that becomes the student merited base visas that go into requiring student to job pipeline. They're going to have a difficult time finding jobs because employers may not be able to pay the kind of prevailing wages that are determined by DOL. So there is this pushback and support on either side of the spectrum for this, but we have to wait and see how this one plays out. But this is a whole gamut of how regulations in the US works.
Yeah, thank you, Sadiq and Teresa, both. A lot of changes to keep track of as these rules get finalized, so I'm sure we will be talking about this on future podcast episodes. To close out our episode this week, we return to a conversation on the president's fiscal year 2022 budget and how it is reconciled in Congress. On our last episode, we touched upon the immigration components of the president's budget request, but we didn't cover in detail how the budget process works in the halls of Congress. With us today to help unpack this is BBC Action Managing Director and former Hill staffer herself, Laura Hall. Laura, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Rachel. Happy to be here.
So I think it would be helpful for our listeners to, start with the basics. The president released his fiscal year 2022 budget request several weeks ago, but we know that the request functions more as a set of, policy priorities rather than an actual budget proposal. Can you talk a little bit about how the president's budget is received on the Hill and how it intersects with the congressional budget process as a whole and the reconciliation process and the appropriations process?
It's complicated and there's a lot going on there. I think you're exactly right that the president's budget whomever the president tends to be a little bit of a statement of administration priorities. Just let's back up a little bit and look at the logistics. The president sends the budget request, kind of puts it out publicly. The next step is Congress kind of taking the various slices of the budget, like funding the State Department, funding Department of Justice, funding the Department of Defense, things like that, and works it through their process on Capitol Hill, the appropriations process. So they'll figure out we're going to give X amount of money to fund this agency and then break it down even further and how much money will go to each specific like subdivision within the agency and program and things like that. The entities are the same, but the numbers might be a little bit different. So President Biden might have allocated X amount of funds to the Department of Defense, whereas Congress might come in and say, we're going to give this, either less or more things. And then the other wrinkle is the House will maybe have a totally different number than the Senate. So while the president's numbers are important, and I think that that's a very good place to kind of look at where the administration's priorities might are, I wouldn't get too caught up on the numbers, because if President Biden proposed X, that probably might not be where, after the congressional back and forth, things end up at the end of the day. So I think you're exactly right in saying that if they're recommending spending more money in a certain area, that's probably rightfully where their administration and kind of where their focus might be for the coming year. But I don't think we should ever consider the president's budget a final number. It's more of an opening gambit, if that makes sense. And again, I'm coming from a perspective as a Hill staffer, as you said, and probably a little bit of like a bias there. The appropriations process and in things on Capitol Hill, the back and forth that happens between the House and Senate is kind of ultimately the number that ends up actually being allocated to the program. But I know Teresa has an agency background. So, and she can take a little peek behind the curtain too of how DHS kind of played in this process and that kind of thing. So I would like to bring Teresa in for a little more insight.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. Most people see the president's budget that's released most years in February. A new president comes in and sort of redoes the previous president's budget a little bit. So they are a little later. And of course, Biden introduced his last month. But the process that goes into that from the agency side is a lot longer. So almost as soon as a president's budget for a fiscal year is released publicly in maybe February, the agencies already are starting on the next fiscal year's budget planning. And so they don't even know how much they're getting for this year before they start planning on what they want for next year. And it's a bottom-up approach. So every government agency that in every department starts with the program level. And the program directors look at their budget from the last year, look at what they want to do for the next year, and basically start there and put together their budget. And then it's rolled up within the agency to an overall agency budget. So let's look, for example, at Customs and Border Protection. It will start with, say, the Office of Field Operation that runs the ports of entry, looking at all their programs, looking at what they want to do in the next year. Maybe they need to replace their non-intrusive detection equipment at the ports of entry, and there's a lifespan that equipment has, and it deteriorates over time. And so they know that a third of that equipment is going to have to be replaced in the coming year. That's the level of detail that goes into the planning at the program level. So they will put that number down, as well as, how many people do we expect to have on board next year, and what's their salary levels going to be? All of that gets put into that programmatic budget. That goes up to CBP, which adds that to the budget that they get from Border Patrol, from their Office of Trade, from the other components of CBP. Then CBP takes their budget and sends it to the Department of Homeland Security. And they have their budget from CBP, from ICE, from TSA, from Secret Service, from the Secretary's office, and roll all that up together. From there, it goes to the Office of Management and Budget, which has the job across the entire executive branch, the entire federal government, of looking at all the program areas across the budget. So they will compare the DHS budget to State Department, to DOD, to DOJ, and the Office of the President may have a top line number that they say, I want the entire federal budget to be no greater than X number of dollars. And so within that, they have to then decide where some more money goes. I want to fund more of DOD. So that means Labor Department, you're going to get a little less money than you asked. That process goes back and forth. There's what's called passbacks. So the Office of Management and Budget, after doing that across the federal government, will pass the budget back to the department and say, you need to trim here, here, and here, or tell us why not, and we'll make the ultimate decision. That process can be iterative, and it goes back and forth until all the final decisions are made, and the president releases his budget in February. As Laura said, Congress takes that and in some ways says, well, that's the number you want, but we have to decide our own number. Within that process, though, the Appropriations Committee staff will go back down to the agencies and say, you asked for this much money for, say, non-intrusive detection. Explain to us why and what that means and why you have to have it now, or can that be put off to next year? So they ask for more information on the details to kind of inform their process. At the end of the day, it is Congress that decides how much money the federal government gets. So they have the final say. But I will say that, yes, the president's budget is an indication of their priorities and policies they want to do, but there's also operational costs in there. And there's a little bit more maybe back and forth, both within an administration and between the administration and Congress in deciding how much actually gets there at the end of the day.
That's really helpful, Teresa and Laura. Having those two differing perspectives, helps unpack an extremely complicated process that I even struggle to understand. To further complicate things, last week, Senate Budget Chairman Bernie Sanders circulated his own budget plan, which proposed spending $1.6 trillion over a decade. And the summary is dubbed a discussion draft for an eventual fiscal 2022 budget resolution, with reconciliation instructions for a filibuster-proof package. And it includes provisions for legalization for many different groups, including dreamers and essential workers and TPS holders. But it also appears that there are a lot of different budget plans floating around the halls of Congress. So Laura, I want to bring you back into the conversation. How does Sanders' plan differ from the presidential request? And what does it mean in terms of next steps for the appropriations process writ large?
Well, let's break it down a little bit. So there's two big things going on with Senator Sanders' draft that he released. There's the actual budget portion, which is, as we kind of discussed earlier, it's the three opening gambits: the president's budget, the Senate version of the budget, and the House version of the budget that'll eventually hopefully come together to make kind of the final budget. But it's one of the initial proposals put out there. And Senator Sanders, as the chair of the Budget Committee, gets to write the Senate budget. The other thing that's going on in this budget that's a bit unique is he included something called reconciliation instructions, which is some policies, the ones that you mentioned, kind of included in this conversation that might not happen in Biden's budget or the House budget. Senate has a unique parliamentary procedure called budget reconciliation, which are ways to kind of get legislative and policy priorities enacted by using some special parliamentary maneuvers that only apply to the budget process. So there are ways to pass a budget to ensure the government is funded, doing it without allowing for a filibuster. So a filibuster is the kind of the way for a minority or some opponents of a legislation to hold up progress on a bill. Budget measures are filibuster proof, essentially, which means that because they're so essential, they have to move forward. You do not need the 60 votes to kind of stop the debate and move forward. Because of that, a lot of members try to find ways to put some of their policy priorities into the budget process. And I think that's what's happening here. So obviously for Senator Sanders and some of his colleagues in the Democratic Party, legalization for dreamers, essential workers, TPS holders, et cetera, is a policy priority that they haven't gotten through kind of the regular order process. So they're hoping that this budget reconciliation process is a way to get that advanced. I think the jury's still out as to whether or not that would be able to happen. In order for a policy to move via budget reconciliation, it has to be proven and ruled by an individual in the Senate known as the parliamentarian, a nonpartisan kind of person who keeps a track on Senate procedures and rules as to what is viable or not to do in terms of the procedure. So the Senate parliamentarian would have to rule that whatever policy is trying to be advanced has a direct budgetary implication. I think that there's certainly ways to argue that DACA and TPS, et cetera, do have a budgetary implication. So they might be ruled germane and able to be advanced in this way. I think there's also an argument to be made that they do not have a direct budgetary implication. We haven't heard the ruling from the Senate parliamentarian on this. This is still a discussion draft, as you mentioned, but that's kind of how it's a bit different from the budgets you might see from Biden or the House, just because it has these kind of reconciliation instructions, also ways to kind of hopefully pass some of these policy procedures through the budget process.
Yeah, I would just add that there's a lot of talk in immigration circles about insisting that this is legal and possible, and people are beefing up their arguments about whether or not immigration meets the rules that Laura talked about. And at the end of the day, it's this parliamentarian that has to rule. And there's been some evidence that some things similar might have been included in reconciliations in the past, and other evidence that maybe it's indirect, as Laura said, and may not. Until that happens, and technically the question has not been put to the parliamentarian yet. There's been a lot of sort of examination and floating around of ideas, but the parliamentarian hasn't been asked to rule yet. That'll come a little bit later in the process eventually. But more so important than that is that even for it to pass in reconciliation, assuming the parliamentarian rules yes, it still needs 51 votes, which means every Democrat has to approve it. We know that the Democratic caucus is generally in favor of these things, but may or may not approve doing it in this way. We know we have senators that have said they don't like pushing policy through reconciliation. The president is talking about large infrastructure investments that would go through reconciliation. So there's a pent-up desire to do a lot of things through this process. At the end of the day, some of that will probably fall off, and a narrower scope of things that are really the priorities for both the president and the Democrats, and can get all the Democrats together, will pass. And whether or not immigration makes that cut is still to be determined.
Thank you both. I'm sure we will be having future conversations to help walk us through this intricate budget process down the line.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Yakino. This Week in Immigration was created by Teresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Teresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahada and Ethan Plotkin produce and edit our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.